So welcome back. In the first part of the lecture we talked a little bit about the overview of assessment and a little bit more detail on summative assessment or formal testing. We're going to focus on the everyday kinds of formative assessment in classrooms now, and I'm going to do that around these four themes. These are the most frequently kind of mentioned aspects of assessment for learning: questions, peer and self-assessment, marking, and the formative use of summative assessments. So, formative assessment, first of all, we'll start with the definition from Black and Williams. And Black and Williams are really the most well-known people writing in this area in the late 90s and early 2000s, and very influential in establishing formative assessment as assessment for learning, or AFL as it's frequently referred to. So their definition is, the term assessment refers to all those activities undertaken by teachers and by their students in assessing themselves, which provide information to be used as feedback to modify the teaching and learning activities in which they're engaged. Such assessment becomes formative assessment when the evidence is actually used to adapt the teaching work to meet the needs of the children. So it becomes formative when it informs our practice, when it informs the process of teaching and learning, and gives it a new form. So there are some problems identified in Black and Williams' survey of research into assessment practice before they promoted assessment for learning. They said that teacher tests encourage rote learning, just sheer remembering the facts and reproducing them in exam conditions or in everyday test conditions. That within school, teachers rarely moderated questions, and so therefore exam papers tended to be relatively unreliable as measures of what children really knew. Whenever you have a test, you tend to emphasise grades and marks. That tends to lead to a focus on competition and comparisons between children, rather than on their own thinking in some depth about the quality of their own learning and what they need to do to improve. Feedback tends to be managerial or social, about how much work people put in or whether they talk too much to their neighbours, rather than to focus on what's actually happening in the test in terms of knowledge acquisition. Tests are used to accurately predict exams rather than to diagnose learning needs, and that teachers tend to prioritise filling up their mark book but not really sharing information between teachers. So you might have very detailed records on a group that you have taught for the year, but at the end of the year, if that group or some of those children move on to be taught by other teachers, we tend to have quite bad systems in school for passing that data on to those teachers. So we're always starting with a blank sheet. Now, here's an extract from a book that was produced by Lambert and Lyons and by a newly qualified teacher, thinking back to their initial assessment practice. So this teacher says, little of my dissatisfaction about marking could have been deduced from my mark book, which was a large buff-coloured commercially printed creation containing hundreds of small boxes into which I carefully inserted codes, grades and symbols derived from an assessment process. At a glance, everything appeared to be in order. There was something in every box. But what did it all mean? Not much, actually. So here's a very honest confession of a teacher saying that yes, they were doing what the department asked them to do. They were filling their book up, their record book, with marks and symbols that demonstrated they were giving some kind of regular assessment judgment of children's work. But really, as a teacher and as an assessor of learning, this person is saying it didn't seem to be leading to a very effective overview. It didn't really feel like it was feeding into improvements in learning. And here's an example of a student assignment that a student I worked with years ago included in a piece of their work. They said, until the time constraints of teachers are relaxed, this powerful learning tool, i.e. formative assessment, will continue to remain a weak part of school's performance. Practicalities of basic marking will ensure this tool is not used to its full potential. In a small school, marking books once every 2 weeks, a teacher could spend up to 20 hours marking, and that's not possible. This student says, I had only 10 classes with 300 students. Marking one book can take 3 minutes. That's 900 minutes a week. That's 15 hours. So the student was just doing basic maths and saying formative assessment can't really be used to have an impact on children's learning because you can't mark their books on a regular enough basis to give them constant feedback. Now, of course, what this student has failed to do, as the previous one had failed to do, is to engage with the breadth of assessment. If we only see marking books as the only way of giving feedback and engaging students in a dialogue about their learning, then of course we'll run out of time and we'll be overworked. So it's important to think about a broader range of things that we can do in the classroom. An assessment for learning attempts to promote that broader range. So Black and Williams would say the purpose of assessment for learning is to enhance self-esteem, which means feedback should be about individuals' work, about their strengths and about what they need to do to develop, and not compare them to other people. They say that self-assessment helps pupils understand the criteria and objectives more clearly. So it's not saying getting children to assess their own work is a replacement for teachers doing it, but it's a useful teaching activity to help the children think a bit more deeply about the quality of work they're doing and what the standard is that they should be striving for. Teaching and planning should always include opportunities for pupils to express their understanding, and that doesn't always have to be in writing in a textbook, in an exercise book. Dialogue between pupils and teachers should be reflective and should be focused so that it enables pupils to express their thoughts clearly so that they can articulate their thoughts, and so the teacher can see what they're thinking, can hear what they're thinking, and can give them feedback on that process in the moment, immediately, with no marking involved. And then finally, tests and tasks should be clearly related to objectives, and pupils should be given the opportunities to act on feedback and advice to demonstrate they've understood the feedback and that they could do better if they had another opportunity. So the first AFL strategy we're going to focus on is questioning. I'm just going to say something briefly about each of these 4 areas. One important thing that emerged from the research on assessment for learning was the use of wait time. Giving children time to think through an answer before we ask for an immediate response encourages them to give longer, more developed answers. It reduces the non-response rate, so it reduces the number of children that simply can't offer us an answer, and it encourages a range of different answers in discussion. So what the AFL advocates were trying to encourage us to do is, instead of coming up with loads and loads of questions every lesson and asking for immediate feedback and looking for whose hand went up the quickest and asking them for the answer, that we deliberately give children 30 or 40 seconds to think of an answer, which means we need to give them a worthy question which is big enough and flexible enough to be used to develop a thought. And that way we don't need to ask children to put their hands up. If everyone's had a minute to think about the answer, then everyone should have something to share. The other thing to do is to develop a range of questions that really promote thinking. So examples in one of the Black and Williams books: if plants need sunlight to grow, how come the biggest plants don't grow in the desert? As opposed to the more closed question, which is, what's the equation for photosynthesis? In history, an example might be, if people knew they would die, why did so many sign up for the army? As opposed to the more closed question, explain what patriotism means. So other strategies we can use, and it's important to have these almost scripted, to have them up your sleeve to use in the classroom, is once we've got an answer, to throw it back out to the children in the classroom and say, well, what do you think of that student's answer? Or can anyone add anything to that answer? Or can anybody explain to me why that's a good answer or why that's the right answer? So using those more open-ended, more interesting questions, give children time to think through the answers, and then give the other children time to respond, to engage, to build on and to refine those answers. So we're much better to come up with fewer, better questions than scatter dozens and dozens of questions around the classroom and expect speedy responses. So here's a checklist that you could use. Ask a colleague to come and observe you and note how many closed and factual questions you ask that require a short, fast response. And ultimately, you'd want to reduce the number of those. How many open questions which invite more than one answer that you can explore with the children? Ultimately, you'd want to increase the range of those. How much time you leave for pupils to reflect? Very often we leave very little time, so most of us need to build in more time for people thinking before we ask for answers. how many further prompts you give to elicit more depth. Very often we settle for the first answer we get and then we move on to the next question. So most of us need to increase the opportunities we give people to give us more depth. How many times you ask a student to explain why they gave an answer. Again, most of us are very happy to accept the answer and move on. So exploring the reasons why, most of us need to do more of that. Opportunities for pupils to confer before answering, so to give them not just thinking time but discussion time. Most of us just want to deal with this as an individual response, so again, most of us in our classrooms will need to build in more opportunities for this. Whether pupils initiate their own questions and comments on other answers, in most classrooms they don't. So we're mostly, if we're trying to implement AFL strategies for questioning, mostly we're trying to do more of that. And finally, ask for feedback on how you distribute questions and answers around the classroom. If we're relying on kids to put their hands up, then by and large we pick on the same kinds of children most of the time. And children who don't know the answers or who want to dodge giving you answers develop strategies for ensuring that you avoid them in class. So mostly we want to increase the distribution of questions and answers around the classroom. So useful, I think, to get feedback from colleagues who can come and observe you. And if you have people observing you as part of the PGCEI course, then maybe give them this slide and ask them to focus just on this in a question where you're doing in a lesson rather where you're doing lots of questioning, to give you feedback and to give you a third-party view of what your approach to questioning is and how successful you're being at moving on your practice. Here's an example from a teacher, or a reflection from a teacher in a book that Black and Williams and others wrote in 2003. Having devised their set of suggestions, they embarked on an implementation program that was encouraging teachers to adopt their suggestions into their teaching practice. And lots of the teachers found it very difficult to get away from these old routines of fast questioning, keeping the pace of the lesson going. But here's a teacher who really engaged with this seriously. And then his reflections are that there were two very significant results from that approach. The most significant one, that was because they all have to explain their answers, that's carried through into written work. And he was saying that children by and large just get used to the assumption that the teacher wants to hear their answers explained, and they carry that on into their written work without being prompted after a few months of doing this kind of work. And then the second impact that he noticed was a girl in his classroom with a statement for special needs who was unable to talk or communicate confidently with adults, had got so used to using the extra thinking time that she was now able to offer answers. That gave her more confidence. So the teacher was able to use that thinking time as a strategy for including more people in the lesson. So the second strategy I'm going to focus on is feedback in marking. The AFL advocates argue that we should really focus on comments and de-emphasise grades, and the easiest way to do that is simply not to give work grades but only to give it qualitative comments. So we don't need to grade every piece of work, we don't need to grade every piece of homework. Just putting some sensible focused markers comments on helps the children focus on their work and their improvement, rather than what they're constantly trained to do is look over each other's shoulders and look at the marks that their friends and colleagues in the classroom got. And we need to avoid bland and non-specific comments such as good work, much neater, good effort, well done. We need to move towards more specific comments such as this is a good, clear results table, but what does it tell you about the relationship? So really focusing in on the tasks we're giving. And we need to try and make sure we give specific action or recommendations. For example, not just you need to improve this, but go back to your notes from the 29th of September, look up chlorophyll, and then rewrite that last paragraph to answer the question using the terminology correctly. So we need to really think in advance. If we're going to invest the time and effort in marking books, then we need to think about what it is that we want the children to do with our comments. And if we want it to feed into future learning, then we need to be really specific and clear about what they've done well, so they can be clear and proud of what they've done well, and what they need to do better, and what you'd expect to see if they were doing it better, and then give them an opportunity to do that. So Facey in Teaching History gives a nice example of where she developed this in a project with her children, talking about A-level teaching here. So she says she started to ask students to give in their work and then write a little paragraph at the end of the work on what went well. so what they were proud of, and what would make the work even better if they had done that. So WWW is what went well, and even better if turns into EBI. And she says that once the students were writing their WWW and EBI statements, Facey says, I found myself answering these comments in my feedback, and then students liked that personalised touch, and then that encouraged her, Facey, the teacher, to develop that as an assessment dialogue. So she says, when Sam observed that he should use peel more, peel is just a strategy for developing more extended paragraphs. P is to make a point, to give an example, and then to explain it. So if the student said to her that I should use peel more, the teacher then wrote back and said, yes, I agree with that. Compare how much better that paragraph 3 is compared to paragraph 2, because you've given it a clearer structure using the point, explain, and give an example structure. So she's arguing that by asking the children to do a little bit of self-assessment, that she can then mark and enter into a dialogue, and then the children can respond back again, or they can improve it before they submit the work again. So the important thing, I think, to point out when we're spending all of that time giving focus marking is, if we want it to be formative, then we need to use time in the next lesson for the children to respond again. Because if we just move on to something different, then we take away the opportunity that it actually feeds into subsequent learning. So one of the reasons why it's worth investing time in sensitive comment-only marking is because it can feed into improvement activities in class. So the third strategy in the AFL toolkit is peer and self-assessment. So in order to ask children to self or peer assess, then we need to give them clear criteria. Teachers need to teach those objectives, explain and model the work to ensure that pupils understand it. Peer assessment skills need to be taught. We can't just assume children can give each other feedback on their work. That requires time. We need to create dedicated activities to give them practice, and we need to then also pay attention to pupils developing skills to self-assess as well as peer assess. The important thing about this is self and peer assessment are routes to independent learning. We're pushing more responsibility on the children to think for themselves about the quality of their work and how to improve their work. And then we need to build in opportunities for them to consciously reflect on that before they hand it in and make revisions. So just like Facey in the last slide was talking about, the student has to tell her what they did well and what they would like to do better, or what they think they could do better on. Then the teacher is able to respond to that as well as the quality of the work. Now this is important because, of course, not all children are equipped to self-assess, and what doing this enables you to do is not just to see if a student is able to do the work or not, but it gives you some insight into their level of understanding. So a student might not be able to do a good essay on a topic, but demonstrate that because they didn't do the preparatory work, or they lost their notes, or they didn't give themselves time to write it. That's useful for you to know in order to make an appropriate diagnosis. But if they give you a self-assessment that says, I think this is a really good piece of work, I've spent days doing this, it's that I'm really proud of it, and the work is very weak, then that gives you another kind of set of comments you can give them in the feedback, and it alerts you to another more urgent type of intervention you might need to incorporate into your planning. So Teachers in the Black and Williams' book shared these reflections on using self and peer assessment. They said any disagreement about the answer was thoroughly and openly discussed in the classroom until agreement was reached. So that really helped them dispel disagreements and misunderstandings. A lot of misconceptions come to the fore, and then we can discuss these as we're going over the work, and we can help to dispel those misconceptions. And the final teacher said, I was really surprised with the attention the children paid to the work and to the levels, applying quality criteria to their work. They gave excellent reasons for giving other people's work the levels they did. So they're really engaging pupils seriously with this helps the children to talk about their understanding, helps the children to think about what they need to do next, and it gives the teacher some useful resources to use in the classroom to discuss mistakes and why they crop up and how to ensure that you avoid them. And then the fourth strategy I'm going to mention briefly is the formative use of summative tests. This is useful if you do a class test or a practice exam, then we need to review the work so we inform subsequent revision. So we need to give time and activities to enable pupils to read and discuss their work, to think about the grades they're given and the criteria that they're working towards. We can ask pupils to set and mark questions for each other that really helps them think about what the topic is, what constitutes success in the exam in relation to that topic. So it gets the pupils thinking about how to demonstrate that they're successful in exam conditions. It gives us the opportunity to use information available to us to inform our planning. So if we've done a practice exam question halfway through a module, we don't just carry on with the second half of the module, we can revisit some of the first module content to sharpen up the children's understanding of that content, and we can use summative tests at the halfway point or a third way through the module as a mechanism for getting some focused feedback for ourselves in terms of how well our teaching's going. Now there is a persistent problem though, and this has really emerged as a serious problem to AFL practice. How do we stop constant collaborative classwork on exams turning into an obsession with teaching for the test? Because if we're not careful, using summative tests frequently, giving children opportunities to engage with the learning criteria, the assessment criteria and the learning outcomes, and constantly teaching about how to do well in tests, can become a bit obsessive, and we can end up spending the whole time teaching how to pass the test. And so therefore it's important to maintain a balanced approach and to use these kinds of strategies at different points in the module or in the scheme of work, but not to use it all of the time, so that children do have opportunities to focus on learning for the sake of learning the topic. And then the question is that we need to hold in balance the fact that they'll be ultimately, in most school systems, that they'll be finally assessed in a summative test. So the only answer that we can give is that it's got to be a balanced approach, and again, teachers being conscious of the risks of tipping over into nothing but preparation for the test is the best safeguard that the teacher will build in a better balance. Here's a teacher talking about their use of summative tests for formative purposes, and they said after each end of term test, the class is then grouped to learn from each other. Some of their comments, the students' comments, show they're starting to value the learning process more highly. They appreciate the fact that misunderstandings are given time to be resolved, either in groups or by me as the teacher. They feel the pressure to succeed in tests is being replaced by the need to understand the work that's been covered, and the test then is just an assessment along the way of what needs more work and what seems to be fine. So here's an example of a teacher I think who's probably getting the balance right. So we've talked about in Assessment for Learning the need to use different types of questions and different strategies for eliciting student responses. We've talked a little bit about the kind of focus marking that we need to give and how it's useful to move away from grades and to move back to more individualised and sharply focused feedback and giving children the opportunity to respond to that marking. We've talked about the process of peer and self-assessment and how that's useful for giving students ownership of the quality of their own work and encouraging them to review with a view to improving their work. And then we've talked about the formative use of summative assessment. That seems to me to have the advantage that it helps you to use that data to improve your teaching, and it helps the children reflect on how well they're doing and what they need to do better so that they can finally pass that exam. So that's Assessment for Learning, and it should be evident that all of these kinds of strategies have to be planned for rather carefully. And so in the last part of the lecture for today's session, I'm going to turn my attention to say something about how we might plan for assessment.